Welcome to part 1 of the portable sound booth project. This actually began over 3 years ago, before the pandemic and before I decided to start making videos again. The first little bit is a webcam pointed out the window at the very initial construction progress. Soon enough, it jumps to the present and my new camcorder takes over. The bulk of filming happened in late March and early April this year. I'm in the completed booth right now recording this voiceover, and the previous 2 videos were also recorded in the booth. Back in spring 2019, Xiaoyan and I were looking to move into an apartment together. She sings and does some voice acting and was already thinking of a recording space upgrade. Before, she was working in a small closet with acoustic tiles stuck to the wall. Moving meant she needed a sound booth to avoid offending or being offended by her future neighbors. There's often zero overlap between waking hours when making noise is allowed, and times when neighbors weren't likely to be home and awake making noise of their own. The booth had to reject noise from outside for clean recordings, contain noise inside to prevent angry neighbors, and squash the reverb typically caused by small spaces. These types of setups are often assembled on site, or built into the room itself as a more permanent fixture. Most portable ones are simply heavy blankets draped over a PVC frame. In our case, we couldn't afford to dedicate an entire room of a 2-bed apartment to a recording rig, and neither neighbors nor apartment management would have looked kindly on a construction project. Xiaoyan's former place was more DIY friendly. If we needed a design which could be disassembled into components light enough for 1 or 2 people to carry, then reassembled after the move. But we wanted the acoustic performance closer to a purpose-built, permanent recording booth. We went through a few design revisions on paper. We settled on a footprint of 3 by 3 feet, similar to Xiaoyan's previous closet setup, with a ceiling 6 feet tall. Just big enough for 1 person and a small amount of equipment, with wall segments small enough to fit through a standard door or up a stairwell. A roof section would go on top, and we'd set a door in one of the walls. Sizing also factored into material selection for reducing waste and cost. Nominal versus actual lumber dimensions took a bit to figure out, which contributed to multiple design adjustments and a lot of sanity checking in the planning phase. We thought about a floor panel too, but as time went on that got put on the back burner in favors of walls and roof, which would do most of the work. In the original plan, the outer layer of the wall would be thin plywood, followed by sheets of sound-blocking mass-loaded vinyl, followed by acoustic insulation, contained by more plywood on the inside, with acoustic tiles to control reverb on the innermost surface. This quickly changed in favor of a cloth inner layer, using the insulation itself to handle most of the reverb with fewer acoustic tiles. This would create an acoustically dead space, but controlled reverb could then be added in post if the track needed it. Attaching the corners in a secure and soundproof, but reversible manner went through even more sets of ideas. Eventually, we settled on using long bolts and clamping some type of gasket at the seams. If needed, we would stuff acoustic material on the outside edges to reduce leakage. Would have been cheaper in the long run to buy everything at once back then, though we did go through some design changes over time that affected the parts list. Total parts and materials came out to about $600 between the original purchase in 2019 and buying the rest in 2022. We began with 2x3 framing rather than a more common 2x4. The booth did not have to be load-bearing aside from its own weight, and smaller lumber was much lighter and cheaper. In hindsight, paying a bit more for quality wood and being more selective in which pieces we bought would have saved a lot of headache. But since 2x3 is a less common size, we had more limited choices and would have had to buy wood over several weeks if we wanted to be any more picky. Wood selection and modifications required are left as an exercise up to the viewer. Measurement took a while as we did not want to mess up and burn through the budget. 9 72-inch long pieces for the long edges because one segment has an extra frame member for supporting a future door, and 8 36-inch pieces for the short edges at top and bottom. We were able to borrow a circular saw for chopping up the lumber, which saved a lot of time and made better cuts than the alternative of using a sawzall. Two big 3-inch deck screws held it together at each joint, and we put effort into keeping things square by bracing the wood on these bricks. The 1/4-inch impact driver packed plenty of punch, but the bit kept jumping off the screw from the force. I'd need to be the Hulk to hold it in place. Fancier star-die screws would have handled the torque better, with less chance of stripping out. Assembly went fairly well considering I have limited experience beyond small items in woodshop class. Xiaoyan never took woodshop class but watches plenty of DIY videos. In the span of a single afternoon, we had 4 wall frames ready, and a plan to jump back in the following weekend. But, just when we were getting started, the prospect of an apartment fell through. Lots of uncertainty ensued, so projects like this were shelved. Until spring 2022 rolled around and a new opportunity for an apartment opened up. So after some discussion, we put down a deposit and began preparations to move. This cranked up the time pressure for completing the booth, as we had barely a month to get everything together while also leaving enough time for packing and the move itself while both of us work full-time, and were often wiped out after work on weekdays. Picking up where we left off on the first weekend, we pulled the frames and mass-loaded vinyl out of storage and chased away the spiders. We got our hands on the 1/4-inch pre-sanded plywood for the outer walls, having the store rip it to the right sizes to facilitate transport and speed of assembly. After weighing pros and cons, we also acquired a bag of Rockwool for acoustic insulation. 12 bats of Rockwool meant for 16-inch on-center stud cavities in a 2x4 wall, or just shy of 60 square feet of coverage, would handle the entire booth. We considered recycled denim, but that would have ballooned the budget. The mass-loaded vinyl came in a 4-foot wide by 10-foot long roll, weighing in at nearly 90 pounds. Stuff is dense, so use caution when handling. Want to take a sec to say thanks for stopping by. Welcome back if you've been here a while, and if you're new here, welcome aboard. I really appreciate it. If you're so inclined, go ahead, poke a couple of those buttons and links down below, and fill the void of the comment section with your thoughts. Back to the construction, we measured out 36-inch segments for the full width of the roll. This would cover 3 walls 3/4 of the way down, plus a strip next to the door, plus extra for a roof section. One of the unused pieces of plywood served as an extra long straight edge. Mass-loaded vinyl is expensive, so we did not want to waste any. Abby, one of the landlord's cats, came to supervise the commotion. Cute as she is not allowed in Shoyun's studio.
There's a blooper.
Scoring with the utility knife would produce very clean cuts, but was going to take way too much time and concentration for all the cuts we needed to make. Utility shears made quick work of the vinyl, but took their share of effort too and didn't produce as nice of a cut. I'm more used to cutting heavy things than Shoyun is, but she's got much finer control than I do. One sheet down. On to the next. And the next. There's some left over, which we're saving for the roof and the front section by the door. Time to mount the vinyl to the frame. Scrap wood comes in handy as supports to keep it from sagging out of position. It's awkward to work with as a combination of heavy, floppy, and somewhat prone to tearing. Up and down on the frame did not matter up to this point, so we chose a side, lined everything up, and tacked the vinyl down with 1 1/4-inch coarse thread drywall screws. Four across the top and 4 down each side for 12 total. Though this part would not be visible, we did space the screws out evenly. Then came the plywood. Props to the store employee for doing a good job ripping it to the dimension we specified. It fit really well. Because this part would be visible on the outside, and the booth was going in either a living room or a bedroom, we measured carefully to arrange the screws so a wonky pattern wouldn't drive us nuts every time we looked at it. The first section took a while to figure out, though the ones after would go much smoother. Worked out to 24 screws. 9 down each side, 3 at the top, and 3 at the bottom. Overkill? Maybe, but we wanted to stiffen the wall. The vinyl is supposed to have some room to move so it can vibrate and absorb sound energy as well as bouncing it back.
The question is how much better this is than the PVC and heavy curtain.
On to the next wall section. This frame had some warp to it, so more of those wood scraps came into play to brace it to a more cooperative shape as shown here. There's something satisfying about knocking those blocks out once the vinyl and plywood was secured. Next frame went together in exactly the same way. For the final frame, for the front wall with the door, we cut a skinny bit of vinyl and secured it like before. Somehow, it was more cantankerous than the larger pieces. With the walls underway, we were losing daylight, so operations moved indoors for the night. We selected a canvas drop cloth as our inner wall and for Rockwool containment. One 12-foot by 9-foot cloth was sufficient. We measured it to the 36 by 75 exterior dimensions of the frame, plus an inch on each edge to fold over to form a hem, so 38 by 77 total per section. A fold to sanity check our measurements, and on to cutting. We could cut 2 at a time, but the scissors wouldn't go through 3 at a time. Pins and a quick pass of an iron to get the hems to lay flat for sewing. And then it was time for us to figure out how to use the sewing machine. We ran into a few predicaments along the way. Reading the instructions helped a lot. We eventually got it right. Shoyun could sew at respectable speed, and I could turn the thing on without breaking everything. The next morning, we put sealant at the seams where the vinyl met the wood. May or may not have been strictly necessary, but figured it couldn't hurt. We selected this light gray color outdoor carpet as a nicer surface to mount over the top of the drop cloth. Interesting color combination with the maroon acoustic tiles we had, but the best option we could get at reasonable price. Bean, the other cat who dares ventured outside, chose to investigate today. We selected some right-angle brackets to help guide the section together for assembly. One at the top and one at the bottom of each edge of the side walls. For the main bolts, we drilled 1/8 inch pilot holes, then 1/4 inch main holes. 6 inch long, 1/4-20 carriage bolts would hold the booth together, 3 per edge for 12 total. Arranging the sections together for the first time, we used the right-angle brackets with more screws to hold the assembly while we lined up the bolt holes. By drilling through the holes we'd already made as a guide, we could increase the chance the bolts would behave. This right-angle attachment saved the day with how close the holes ended up being to the inside and the mass-loaded vinyl. With the main walls together, it felt cramped and roomy in there at the same time, and made for some amusing reverb effects.
Mass-loaded vinyl chamber.
Putting the front wall on, we repeated the technique we used at the rear, tacking with brackets top and bottom, and punching through the bolt holes to mark where we needed to be. We took it off right away and drilled the rest of the way through.
Have a kebab.
The front went back on fairly easily, and we took the chance to seat the bolts by bracing with nut and washer on the front side, and tightening to dig the carriage bolt head into the backside. We repeated this for the rest of the front bolts, but it slipped our minds for the bolts on the back wall. On to the Rockwool. Two bats side by side at full length, then one more bat cut in half filled most of the wall cavity, but was a bit sparse in the middle. We'd also failed to trim the long edge of the canvas, so Shoyun went to adjust that while I prepped the carpet. 12 feet by 6 feet, so all I had to do was cut it into quarters. That piece of wood looks a lot less like a straight edge from this angle. Had another supervisor stop by to point that out. To fill the remaining gaps in the Rockwool, we chopped one bat into 5 3-inch wide sections to pack the cavity. The canvas got stretched over the frame and secured with staples. Carpet went over the top the same way with more staples, and we had the back wall complete. Pro tip: make sure settings are correct on your tools. We had so many jams until we got the staple gun dialed in for the staples we were using due to confusing instructions. Inspector Pillbug swung by to check on us and give approval.
Stick leggy out.
Next, we put together one of the sidewall sections in decent time.
Wow, no misfires.
Only to realize we forgot to mount the bolts on the back edge. Thankfully, we didn't have to undo everything. Just pull a few staples and pry the carpet and cloth enough for Shoyun to feed the bolts through. We did not make the same mistake on the remaining sidewall, and that went together fastest out of all of them. The front wall needed a bit of adjustments first. Trimming the vinyl for a clear doorway, and trimming the plywood to not stick out past the edges. We couldn't manage to borrow a circular saw this time, so had to make do with the Sawzall. To make the front panel sit flush, we used some of the leftover strips of plywood as spacers before we screwed everything together and punched the bolt holes all the way through. One of the last remaining Rockwool bats went in the mini cavity in the front. It got a similarly small cloth panel and a special cut-to-fit piece of carpet, which would double as a gasket when the sections made it together. Onto the roof, or lid. This was the least defined part of the design when we started, but we worked out a plan for a double-layered assembly that would muffle and block sound, but allow for ventilation airflow. Unfortunately, the warped lumber had warped even worse as it dried, which made for some complications. Getting new lumber would have made for less cattywampus pieces, but cut into the budget, and at this time we were in the middle of supply chain and inflation hell. Measure twice, or thrice, and cut once. Sawzall couldn't make as nice of a cut as a circular saw, but good enough for our purposes if I kept a steady hand. Always sanity check before committing. The wood was tougher, and several screws would not go in without pilot holes. Bricks helped again with squaring the warped wood, but it decided to fight us. It ended up pretty crooked at the end after all. Adding the bracing helped a little, but not as much as we'd like. With a quick wipe down, the last of the vinyl got prepped for installation. There's a gap in the middle, but that works to our favor, as the hot air has to escape the booth somehow. Ventilation holes would be cut in later on. More leftover plywood from the wall sections formed the outer layer. Despite the warp in the horizontal plane, the roof was reasonably square instead of the parallelogram nightmare we expected. For good fitment, we attached plywood, then trimmed to fit using the frame as a guide. Circular saw with dedicated guides would have made a much nicer cut. Now for the inner reverb damping part of the roof. Another frame, slightly less crooked than the first, if only by virtue of smaller dimensions. We were running out of plywood, but had just enough after all. Attach, then cut to length, just like the outer roof section. A small amount of tape covered the gaps at the edges to keep the Rockwool in place. The final back got trimmed to fit, plus a sliver of leftovers from the skinny pieces we cut for the wall sections. Cloth got stapled down tighter than the walls to keep everything in place. We were afraid of sagging, but it held shape better than we anticipated. 2 sections of leftover carpet matched the ceiling appearance to the booth walls. The inner section made it to the outer section. We rotated it to try fighting cattywampus with cattywampus when we tighten it down. Larger than normal pilot holes through the inner section frame, then 4 3-inch screws to hold it down tight. Still a bit weird, but better than before. With the main pieces done, we were ready for a test fit, with one small bit of planning ahead first. Wrapping and tying bits of yarn around the bolts would jam them in the holes, preventing them from accidentally getting pushed back in. That would require undoing staples all over again to retrieve them. After some wrangling and a healthy smattering of curses from both of us, we got the booth slotted together. Initial tests were quite promising, as the noise of Shoyun's fridge vanished by stepping inside, even without any door. While we were out of energy and out of weekend daylight, the major building was over. We could rest easy and plan for the next steps. Coming up next time: slick lighting, ventilation, real door? The main structure's done, but there's a long way to go before we have a functional booth ready for move-in. Thanks for watching, everyone. I appreciate you sticking around to the end. As a reward, you get some outtakes because I sure as heck could not do this voiceover seamlessly in one go. No chance. Until next time. Measure twice or thrice, and several screws refuse to go without plot holes. And tighten to dig the carriage head bolt into the backside. Now for the inner reverb dancing.